right, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So good morning. My name's Maygen Moore. I'm the Senior Community Investment Officer at CSH, also known as Corporation for Supportive Housing. Many of you probably know CSH for our national policy advocacy and training work, but we're also a CDFI. We're managing currently about $130 million loan fund, and out of that loan fund, we provide pre-development acquisition funding to service providers and developers who are building supportive housing. So that is my role at CSH, covering the New York market. I'm going to have our great panelists here today introduce themselves, but just to kind of warm it up, we have Mike Dehmler from CSD Housing, Karen Gorman from Federation of Organizations, and Martha Masoero, I'm sure I butchered her last name, my apologies, from Services for the Underserved. So Mike, could you kick us off with a little intro?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. So we were asked to sort of describe our perspective at it. So CSD Housing, it's a JV panel, but we're essentially consultants. My background was I was the president of Krista Construction, which is a large upstate housing builder. And Steve Trinelli and I, who might be here somewhere, started the Mission Housing Group at Barclay Damon. So I'm a lawyer contractor, and our perspective is as consultant.
Good morning. I'm Karen Gorman from Federation of Organizations. We are the, junior not-for-profit at the table right now who are in the midst of doing some supportive housing and some affordable housing in joint venture partnership with CSD Housing. So we bring that perspective.
Hi, good morning. Martha Masoero. I'm the Director of Housing Development at Services for the Underserved. So I bring, the seasoned nonprofit developer perspective to the table. My background's in affordable housing development, pretty new to supportive housing. But yeah, we do, as Services for the Underserved does both projects on their own and in joint venture with for-profit developers. So that's my perspective.
Great, thank you, panelists. So we are going to start with a little icebreaker scavenger hunt that I like to call It Takes a Village. So the purpose of the scavenger hunt is to just kind of remind us and ground our conversation on the basics of what it takes to get a supportive housing deal developed. And so there'll be more revealed to you after you break off in teams and scavenge your items. But what I need you to do right now is to break into about teams of 4 or 5 people. Doesn't have to be formal, just whoever's sitting next to you, it's fine. Just grab 4 people. If you can get 5, that'll probably be better. You get a more of a chance to win. And then these are the items that I need you to scavenge, okay? So each item is gonna represent a crucial aspect of the development process. So I'll give you about 5 minutes. 1 minute to break into teams. So competitive. All right, guys, what do you got?
I got a phone. Oh my God.
I have keys.
Oh, keys, that's good.
I have ID.
Cell phone. The clutcher is the mail file that's user lost.
I don't have any of those things.
I think I have a tweezer.
Wow.
I brought.
It'll look suspicious if the person that made the list is on the winning team. You just put it in the hat, and then at the end we'll just throw it up in the air and everybody will get back something.
Got a tweezer.
Oh, wow.
Oh, look at you.
So we got tweezer, phone, ID. Wow. Lip balm?
Oh, look at that. That counts.
Lip balm, wow. Do we get double points for
I
that?
just need to remember to take my keys back. So I can
I have lots of keys.
I have 2 phones. What phone are my
Oh,
That is strong. That's dedicated. I would literally, it would just be twice as many lost holes.
Like, is it a stencil floss? No one will know, right? That's what
No one will know. It's perfect.
The standing joke in my office is I've lost five credit cards so far in this calendar year. And when I was down 2 weeks ago, I lost a fifth, and I called up this, like, Mr. Governor, this is the fifth replacement.
All right, I'm going to give you another 90 seconds.
Well, that's not, I mean, you don't use them.
I just leave them.
You just leave them at the bar.
Yeah.
It's not losing.
No,
Like charity.
it's okay.
Share a quarter. Here's a MasterCard.
Some competitors in the room. I love it. All right. We could take our seats. How many winning teams do I have? Ooh, oh gosh, I don't know if I have enough prize. Very, very impressive.
So aren't you going to vet them? Make sure. You better vet them and make sure
I
they
know. Yeah, let me check.
make them show the floss. Tweezers, that's great. I love that. Yeah, see, that's definitely a known cheater. I did write myself some notes. I had this feeling I won't glance at any of them.
Look at what we have. All right. So the point of the exercise, I give you 20 seconds to wrap up combos so we can move ahead. I'm glad everybody's so interactive. That's great.
Wow, you really are doing it.
All right, guys. Let's move forward so we can hear from our panelists. Okay, so the point of the exercise was for all of us to get a little bit grounded in what it takes to develop a supportive housing project, right? So we had these 5 items. Be nice to my colleague Zara. We have more goodies at our table. So if she can't get to everybody, please stop by the CSH table. I'll be sure to take care of you. Thank you for participating so actively. So the point of the exercise, as I was saying, was to ground our conversation and remind us of what it takes to get a supportive housing deal developed in New York. So each of the items that you scavenged is representative of a key aspect to a supportive housing development project, right? So I didn't really think too much about what item represented what, so don't think too much into it, please. I know we're all smart people. I wasn't thinking that hard about it, I promise. So just to go over it quickly, though. So the keys in our game represented a board that's on board, right? We know that we need our board to be a part of this new kind of goal or trajectory in our organizations. If you haven't done supportive housing congregate development, or you've done a little bit, maybe not a lot, and you really want to take this on as a new revenue stream in your organization, your board needs to be on board, right? Nail file, tweezers, or floss, right? That was supposed to be the hard one, but I guess a lot of people carry that around with them. So very impressive. Service and operating contract. These projects don't happen without that. We need our ESHI, we need our 1515. Cell phone was representative of development capacity, right? And that's really what we're talking about today. Does your organization have the development capacity in-house? Do you need to get a consultant, or do you want to go ahead and joint venture with another organization, right? Your ID represented financial capacity. Does your organization have financial capacity? That can also be a driver to joint venturing with another organization. We know, and our panelists will probably touch on it a little bit, that if you're looking to do a tax credit deal, using tax credits as part of your supportive housing development, your nonprofit organization needs to have at least $1 million of liquidity, so at least $1 million of cash, or the tax credit investors, those organizations, institutions, people who buy the tax credits will not invest in that project, right? And the lip balm was a representative project site. So I know that sounds pretty obvious, but I do have a lot of calls from people who, oh, I have my eShy award, and I'm like, okay, great. Do you have a site? No. How do I get a site? And it's a longer conversation, but you need a site, right? And so these are all the basic things that are needed. Can anybody identify maybe 1, 2 things that you think are absolutely crucial? Like, what's the linchpin here? Come on, you guys were all talkative 3 minutes ago. Let's go. Throw it out. Financials. Financial capacity. 1 and 4. Site control. Oh, wow, we're all over the place here. So, well, what I've identified as the linchpins are those items on this in this scavenger hunt that are driven by the nonprofit, right? You cannot have supportive housing in New York City unless you have a nonprofit service provider at the table. So in this scenario, what's driven by the nonprofit is their board, right? Their board has to allow them to engage in this way and take on these projects. And then right behind that, their ability to get the service and operating contract. If you're looking for a partner or a partner is looking for you, they can't do this deal without a nonprofit who has the ability to get a service and operating contract, right? And that's, I think, the whole point of why this joint venture conversation keeps coming up. You'll hear it a lot from Shinny, you'll hear it a lot from CSH, because we really want nonprofits to understand what their appropriate seat at the negotiation table is. I always tell my nonprofits, you're not in the high chair. If there's 2 chairs, 2 lead chairs at a table, 2 head chairs, you're in one, and your for-profit or nonprofit development partner is on the other, because they can't do that project without you. And a lot of times we find that nonprofits are negotiating from the wrong chair. They're like in the high chair. they want to, or they feel relegated to the high chair, not really understanding the value and the necessity, the value that they bring to the projects, and the necessity that the service and operating contract brings to any project, right? So we keep having this joint venture conversation because we're building the capacity for our service organizations and building their understanding of what the true role that they're playing. And so with that, this is anyway, so at the top it says financing sources, which are all these items on the left, and you can kind of see it on the wall in the back. And on the right, it says nonprofit needed, yes or no. And you'll see how many yeses there are, right? So in all of these subsidy sources, the nonprofit is needed to be able to access the subsidy source. And that's the only way that these deals pencil out. You need to have the service and operating, and you need to have access to the capital subsidy. In each of the ones listed here, you'll see that the nonprofit needs to be the applicant, needs to be in the ownership structure of the project. And so this is like my favorite slide, because when I put this up, people are like, oh, I get it, I understand. Like, these deals really can't happen without your service provider at the table. And so just to give us a little bit of background of how we got here, like, look at all these sources that we have, right? So in 2017, most of us know that the city and state announced new financing initiatives known as eShy and NYC 1515. Does everybody know what eShy is? I just want to make sure I'm not glazing over that. Yes? Okay. NYC 1515, both service and operating initiatives that allow projects to be developed, right? And then together, they're expected to provide 35,000 units of supportive housing over the next 15 years, most of which will be new construction. So the service and operating dollars are also supported by these funding sources at the bottom here, which are the capital subsidies from the city and state, namely HHAP, SHOP, SHELP. These are the capital subsidy sources that are actually used for the construction. So why do nonprofits want to do joint ventures? There are a lot of reasons, and we're going to hear from our panelists in just a few minutes. But what we've been seeing is most of them are looking for another revenue stream. It's hard to come by unrestricted assets in nonprofit world. Everything's tied to a contract or a foundation source, and when you're getting unrestricted cash from your developer fee, then that really benefits the financial condition and builds the financial capacity of nonprofit organizations, right? Access to land. A lot of nonprofits are joint venturing with developers because developers have staff that all they're doing is looking for land. That's all they do. Most service providers don't have in-house staff that are just looking for land. There's a million other things to do, land not being one of them. Financial guarantees, right? It really takes an organization that has a strong balance sheet and a board that's willing to guarantee different aspects of the development project, and a lot of times organizations aren't able to do that, so they'll partner with a developer for-profit entity who can help provide the financial guarantees. Management experience. When you start moving into tax credits, affordable housing tax credit world, there's a whole compliance, lease-up, reporting structure that a lot of nonprofits may not already have in-house, right? And the deals have gotten bigger and more complex. In New York City, if you're looking at a 4% tax credit deal, they're pretty much over 100 units, right? 9%, maybe 70 units to 100 units. So these are big projects. It's not your scattered site project. It's not your OMH, one-stop shop project. It's a lot of funding sources at the table with a lot of different parties that need to be navigated. And oftentimes our nonprofits don't have that capacity, so joint venturing makes a lot of sense to them. And so on the other side, why do our for-profits or nonprofit developers want to partner with service providers, nonprofits? Well, we've been talking about it. Nonprofits have access to resources that cannot be accessed by for-profits, right? So the subsidy sources, sometimes it's land. The city and state still have quite a bit of land that they own, and a lot of times that they're requiring that a nonprofit at least be part of the development team, if not the actual RFP applicant. Below market rate debt. I can speak to that specifically. At CSH, we are very competitive. I think organizations would be hard-pressed to find another lender with as competitive terms as we have. 100% loan to 130% loan to value, 6% fixed interest rate. Interest is accrued and deferred. These are, loan terms that affordable housing developers and market rate developers know that they cannot access without having a nonprofit at the table who's pursuing supportive housing. Construction profits, zoning, and tax incentives. So the list goes on, but I just wanted to ground our conversation in how we got here and what the benefits are that supportive housing service providers and developers bring to the table. So the questions for the panelists, I'm taking it in two parts. The first part is kind of setting the stage for the organization that's thinking about joint venturing. What are the goals? What are the discussions that are happening inside of the organization as you're considering going into a joint venture, and how are you getting organized around that? So I wanted to start with Karen. And Karen, can you share with us maybe 2 or 3 main goals that Federation was thinking about as they were thinking about pursuing joint ventures and pursuing development in this way? Because you all actually have a lot of scattered site experience, and so you're on a little bit of a departure into more of a congregate model. And so if you could just talk about that transition and the goals that you were hoping to achieve by joint venturing.
Just as a side, this is a new question from Maygen. She didn't give us this question ahead of time. So I think for Federation, we have had some experience developing congregate housing in the past, but they have been 2 50-unit projects that were OMH, 100% OMH. So moving into affordable and supportive housing together has been something we've been looking at for probably the past 6 or 7 years, since things have been changing in the way that housing has been developed. So that seemed to be the next natural step for us, is to develop that type of housing. So for one goal. The secondly, based in primarily on Long Island and in New York City Metro, in particular on Long Island, there's not a lot of housing opportunities available for our folks. So I think it's a mission-based opportunity for us to start to develop that type of housing, not only for folks that are vulnerable, but also for individuals that are in need of affordable housing. So we all know that affordable housing in New York City and Long Island is not easily accessible. And I think down the road, as Maygen mentioned earlier, just having the access to developer's fee and new income streams and increasing our assets is also another large part of it for a not-for-profit to have access to developers' fees as seed money for the next project, or just to have unrestricted funds to put into other programs is something that, of course, we're all interested in, I think.
Great. Martha, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. So I think for SUS, housing development has been a part of what we do and part of our mission for a long time. We have over 900 units of tax credit units and over 2,000 in pre-development. So it's not new to us. But I think, when we think about joint venturing, it's really about a balance, right, between what is fiscally responsible, how much can we manage in terms of capacity internally, but also, I think we've done deals on our own. The goal is to continue to do deals on our own and in joint venture partnership, and I think for us the threshold is really to have a real seat at the table and to be in true partnerships rather than in a minority seat.
Mm-hmm. Karen, as you were talking about it internally and making the decision to go in this direction, what did some of those conversations look like? Like, who was having the conversations? Was it exec team? Was it exec team first and then they went to the board? Like, can you just talk a little bit through some of the...
Sure. So it certainly started with our executive team and the board. As we did our last congregate project that ended, I think, around 2000. We closed in 2012, or actually opened in 2012. That's when I believe we signed the joint venture with CSD, who was a different name then. But we, from the beginning, realized, I think, the board and the executive team, that having experts and having people that have done this type of work before kind of work side by side with us has been very important and integral to any kind of success we were going to have as an agency coming from 100% OMH projects into projects that have, various stacks of funding and in New York City and on Long Island.
Mm-hmm. And Martha, I know SUS has been doing this a long time, so maybe the conversations have already been had with the executive team and board, like you already know what your strategic plan is and you've fully taken this on as a revenue stream. But as you're making decisions on a project-by-project basis and you're looking at different joint venture panels, because SUS is very interesting, is that a lot of organizations, they get a partner like CSD and they stay with that partner. And SUS has adopted a little bit of a different model where they have many different partners. And so can you talk about the decision to do that and like the strategy behind that?
I can't talk to it because I'm not an executive. I don't sit on a board. And I think part of, when we were talking about this panel, part of the interesting position is, we talk about joint ventures all the time. And especially for an SUS who's been doing this for a long time, it's less about those initial conversations and moving in that direction and more thinking about what are our long-term goals? Do we want to do more projects on our own? Do we want a bigger share of projects where we do joint ventures? And I think the more you do this, the more really thinking about what your staff gets out of deals is important. And I know we'll talk about this later. But I think for SUS, again, because we do this all the time, it's really more about taking a step back from the exec room, from the boardroom, and thinking about how do we make deals that will make our staff feel like they have a real sense of ownership into the project and want to keep doing this with us over and over again.
Great. Can you, Mike, talk a little bit about, from your perspective, when you're approaching a new joint venture with a new organization, like what are your considerations and what your goals are? Because I do think that sometimes nonprofits maybe forget or aren't thinking as much about the for-profit developers' goals, and that can be, that can make their negotiation a little bit more difficult, because a real negotiation is where both parties are meeting goals, and so you kind of have to be aware of what the developer is coming to the table with, or what the consultant's coming to the table with, so that you can negotiate appropriately. So can you talk about your goals?
Yeah, of course. So I mentioned in the beginning, we're not really a JV partner. We're much more of a consultant. More recently, some of the financing has required us maybe a longer-term role for us than when our company first started. And the client's needs vary wildly. So I've come to call it proximity theory. Like, we're with our clients a lot. We spend a lot of time together. It's a very long-term partnership. You're going to be together, particularly in a JV, for 15 to 30 years. And as a general proposition, we think, knowing our clients, understanding what their mission is, we always call it mission housing. We don't have any straight affordable deals. It's all supportive in one way or another. Allows you to sort of work through challenges. So Karen and Barbara were our first client, along with Well-Life, and I just observed that we all met each other 7 years ago, and they're all here. Like, every one of them came to support this presentation, and I know everything about them, and I see them all the time. And so we have this relationship of trust that has got to be the start of any partnership. So specific to your question, there are not-for-profits that want to get into housing for a variety of reasons that have no staff. You have an executive director that's sort of part-time developer, but mostly managing their organization and taking care of clients, and they need tons of support, right? They haven't seen it, they haven't bought land, they haven't negotiated contracts, they don't know what the financing applications look like. And in those contexts, we provide a lot of services. In the case of like a Concern, who we occasionally work with, they don't need us for all that, but what they do need occasionally is just knowledgeable capacity. There's only so many projects that SUS or Concern can do at one time with their staff. So CSD provides, 10,000 labor hours available a year with our staff that we can divert into projects where maybe there's just not enough capacity at that moment in time. So we have the whole spectrum, and it really comes down to whatever the not-for-profit thinks that they don't have at that time to pursue the mission.
Can you give any advice on what nonprofits should be thinking about, should be getting organized around before approaching a consultant like yourself?
I knew obviously in advance you're going to ask that. I've been trying to think about it, and it varies wildly. We have 22 projects in pre-development, and I would say that every one of them is totally unique, and the challenges are unique. So I would look at it in that sort of relationship context. If you have a relationship of trust, then it should be a situation where you can sit down and have an honest discussion about what you want. So take site selection, and take me and Karen as an example. Karen knows way more than I do about individual towns in and around Long Island. She knows a lot more than I do about where her clients live and what they need. She has the relationship with OMH, and I'm glad to see OMH is here to support us today. So we need all that. Like, she's got to tell me where we want to be, why we want to be there, how it furthers the mission. We don't build in places where people don't need us, and the not-for-profit really should be the gatekeeper on that. But she may not know enough as much as I do about geotechnical reports or surveys, or maybe she's not comfortable negotiating with their in-house lawyer on the land acquisition or things of that nature. So you sort of look at the problem, and it should be sort of, we shouldn't be there unless we have something to offer, and fundamentally it's still got to be driven by the not-for-profit. We look at due diligence the same way. From the not-for-profit side, we really need them to engage with the community. Somebody from Rochester coming down that's not a social worker, that doesn't do much in terms of caring for people with mental health challenges, is not a super sympathetic speaker in terms of, gathering community support. On the other hand, I know an awful lot about, what a geotech report means and what it might do to the construction budget. So we sort of divide the tasks in that manner, and it's been wonderful. And as I said, it's been years and years and years, and we're still together and enjoying the process. So that would be my best advice, is to find somebody you like and trust and know, and then have sort of frequent and in-depth discussions about what you really need. Your for-profit should be teaching you, like at the end of a financing application, you should know a lot more about it than when you started. That should be knowledge that becomes part of your in-house, maybe with the hopes of someday not needing a consultant. So it varies. I'm sorry I can't pin it down.
No, that's great. That's great. And that actually leads to my next question. I was going to ask Karen and Martha, what do you feel like your organizations have gained, like concrete, tangible skills, capacity? What do you think your organizations have gained from joint venturing?
So I think, to piggyback on what was said, good partnerships are ones that are complementary, right? And capacity building is a two-way street. I'd like to think we've taught our partners a few things over the years. And,
great point.
And so I think really finding partners that identifying your weaknesses and strengths is step one, because then you can find a partner who will complement your weaknesses. And so, sometimes we divide it out, especially if you're partnering with a partner that may be a self-performing GC. They will know a ton about construction. But there's a lot more to these deals, as you mentioned in your opening, than just construction. And so, splitting up roles so that everyone is bringing their strengths to the table, but also learning from partners so that next time around, maybe we don't need you. And so I think SUS has learned a lot on the financing side, on the construction side. Every deal is so unique, and it doesn't matter, nonprofit, for-profit. We learn something every time we do this. So I don't like to think about it in terms of what have they taught us. It makes it sound like we're a damsel in distress that needs saving. I think we each learn from each other. That's just, the housing world is such a great world, and we all learn from each other regardless of where we sit.
Mike, I want you to give the people something very tangible. Like, what do nonprofits miss in their negotiations?
Again, another question I knew was coming. It's hard to ask. So I guess I've seen two categories of it. So as I mentioned before, I'm also a lawyer at Barclay Damon, and the Mission Housing Group does work outside of CSD. So I have occasion to look at it from that perspective, and I have occasion to look at it in the deals we're negotiating. So there are for-profits that own land, have big balance sheets, that are going to not-for-profits and saying, look, we'll give you, 30 Eshai beds and 10% of the developer fee, or some number that's much less. So our model, it doesn't work that way. Like, no deal we have ever done does the not-for-profit get less than half the developer fee. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really get missed because it's never, I don't know how to describe it. It's not an argument. Like, we go in knowing full well that we're going to be, at best, equal partners on it. So that's what I would say that I've seen, this split between people that really are dominant, that are really just looking to get the not-for-profit subsidy, and then sort of the other side of the world that's actually in mission housing in the sense of wanting to bring OMH beds online or whatever the particular population is. Mm-hmm. And then I think some people don't realize the complexities of the financing and the complexities of the due diligence process, and it's just a matter of going through it once or twice. It's certainly not damsel in distress. We actually, I would say the exact opposite, but if you haven't done it, you haven't done it. Being a great social worker doesn't necessarily mean you know a lot about whether a 35-foot hill on your property is going to be expensive to deal with or not, right? It's just, you learn it when you learn it, and anyways.
Just to add to that, I think for a federation as kind of newer in this process over the last couple of years and working with a joint venture or working with CSD, one of the things that I find that has been so helpful is just the network and the opportunity to meet people in other industries. You mentioned being a social worker. I'm a social worker by trade. I've been, with Federation for 14 years in clinical capacity and administrative capacity, and now in this new role as in housing development. So working with CSD has afforded the opportunity to meet with, architects and zoning attorneys and, groups that do lease up and groups that do all sorts of these other projects or all these parts of the project that I wouldn't have met, and developing Federation's relationship with these folks upward and aside from with CSD. So I think that leads you down the road as a not-for-profit to eventually at some point be able to run your own projects and not have to have a JV partner if you don't want to have one. Not that we would ever consider that, but I think it opens up a whole new world to nonprofits that haven't done it before, and it's really valuable, and it's eye-opening, and it increases your ability to kind of move in these directions that you wouldn't have before. So in other words, I find a site and I am interested in it, I'll call the architect myself. I won't even clue Maygen until it's a possible or a not if I don't need to. So those kinds of things happen without the JV partner.
Right. Over time, you get those skills and that confidence. It's interesting because from a funder perspective, I see joint ventures in a lot of different formats, and sometimes I have joint ventures where I rarely ever talk to the service provider. I always push back on that, but if that partnership had its way, the service provider would never talk to me, the funder, and I always feel like that's a missed opportunity for service providers, even just to sit in on the phone calls. And so I wanted to hear from you all, if the goal of a service provider is to eventually maybe do development on their own, what kinds of conversations or what type of negotiations should they make early on in the relationship to make sure that they're actually getting the skills that they need?
So related to that and to what was just said, I think I personally come from an affordable housing development background, so I acknowledge that I'm not a social worker, never have been, and so I know a lot of service providers are getting into housing development as a new thing. And to be clear, not all service providers have to be developers. You don't have to be. If you don't want to be, if you shouldn't do it, right? But I think as some service agencies have, including SUS a long time ago, decided to move into development, I think you can either think of housing development to the point of unrestricted cash as a way to fund and better serve your clients, or you can think, which is my personal position, that bricks and mortars are mission, right? Our mission can be expanded to include housing development, and so it doesn't become a means to an end, it becomes part of the end. Sorry, that was not the answer to your question.
We answer whatever questions we want up here.
That's right.
My panel's gone rogue. I want to kind of thank you for that. I think that's very good information and insight. But I do want to make sure that the audience leaves with like some really tangible tips on how to approach their joint venture and that they're actually getting to the goals of the organization. So I do talk to a lot of service providers from my stand in the deal that actually do have ambitions of being able to do the development themselves. And depending on the development partner, I'm not always sure that they're getting the skills that are really moving them in that trajectory. So I wanted you all to talk about how you're working with your partners so that you can actually gain the skills. Like, where are you interjecting yourself? What are the right questions to ask? Should you make that part of your negotiation early on before you even sign on to being a joint venture partner? So that's what I'm trying to get to.
So, I mean, I think for Federation, and Mike can attest to this, I fight with him all the time about stuff. And
It's outrageous.
Like what? Like what are
so
you
for
fighting with them
instance,
about?
if there's, I want to be involved with every decision that's being made, or Federation wants to be involved with every decision that's being made about projects. So if ever something comes up and I'm not aware of it, he will get an earful about it. So I think really being available, like my position at Federation is 80% just doing this. The other 20% is other development, smaller development, but 80% is really what I'm focusing on and is new housing development. So if there's a meeting, if there's a call, if there's an RFP, if there's a site, if there's anything that's happening with it, that's involving with any of our projects, I want to be involved with it, even if it's just to listen. Even if I have no idea, like years ago, I had no idea what anybody was talking about at all. I was there listening and writing words down and then Googling what like geotechnical meant afterwards because I'm a social worker, and why would a social worker know what that is? So I think that is, if for not-for-profits who are interested in going into this initially, you have to maybe consider having a point person that works directly with the JV and then is kind of coordinates all of the other groups that work in terms of housing development, like the people I mentioned earlier, architects, lawyers, funders, so that the not-for-profit knows what's going on in any minute of the day. And I know very well that Barbara, my CEO, can call me and say, what's going on with this project, and I want to be able to give all that information immediately without an issue because the board wants to know or because something else is going on. So.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think we are all good at signing an MOU and saying, this is going to be a real partnership. Everyone's going to be at the table every step of the way. And then the emails happen, the calls happen. Why did you call the bank without me? Why is there this major change in design that I have to hear about 3 days later? Why wasn't someone from my staff on the original email, right? And so that's why, to me, the key to this is bringing it down to the staff level. Our project managers are literally the reason projects get done. And so we can be up here signing 30%, 40%, 70% of developer fee. The project managers on both sides have to know what the agreement is and actually be told to abide by it. And so that means real communication. It means internal calls that are safe spaces. We can ask all the dumb questions we want. Let's not do it on a closing call with all the banks and the city. But that's why you do the internal call, so that you don't have to not ask the question because it's a closing call and there's 30 people on the call, right? Right. And if we're partners, there is no question you don't have to answer. Mm-hmm. There is no dumb question. I'm in this, we're in this together, and we can adjust. And I'm a big fan of feedback loops, both internal and external. Talk to your staff. What's working? Do you feel left out? Do you feel in the loop? And then at whatever level appropriate, you can reach out to your partner and say, hey, this isn't working for me.
No, I think that's perfect. I'm totally in agreement with that. I think sometimes there's a misstep of not actually having a point person on the side of the nonprofit. So and it can't be the executive director. Executive directors have argued with me about this, and I tell them no. You need a staff person who's going to be in charge of doing everything Martha just said, everything Karen just said, that's going to hold your partner to the MOU and whatever other negotiations that have been made around the partnership, who's regularly checking in on that and is coming back to you, the ED, if they need support to make sure that everybody's sticking to the parameters of that original negotiation. So this is a great segue into kind of the second half of the questioning for the panelists. So now I want to move into the area of the deal or the project where you already have you already have the partner. So it's like, I have a partner, now what? Now what happens? What's happening day to day? And you've started to talk about it a little bit, but just really getting, specific and giving the audience some tips about, what's the reality? How often, like Karen, how often do you talk to Mike or somebody from his
Too
office?
much. How's that?
I'm going to need a social worker when I'm done with this panel.
That's right. You'll learn. No. So I think it depends on where you're at with projects, how many projects. So some of the things that come up, I think, for day-to-day that need to kind of be ironed out when you first start a joint venture is who's paying the invoices when you start kind of developing, when bills start coming in as you work with, attorneys or land people, architects. I think that we talk pretty consistently, either Mike or someone from his team, about what projects we have going on and, go over basically like a weekly or a monthly punch sheet of all the things that we need to get done in order to kind of keep our projects moving forward or mitigate whatever issues or concerns that are coming up for what we're working on. Federation as a whole, and this is something to consider for people that are coming into joint ventures, is, we put out a lot of capital or a lot of liquid now in pre-development, and that kind of will, for whatever deal it is, may get rolled into the financing or when you get your money for the projects, or it may not, or it may be a part of the developer's fee. So just those kinds of things you need to kind of, I think, iron out initially, because pre-development can be very, very expensive. You know, people that are skilled to do these things cost a lot of money, and we need to pay them in order to do it. So I think it's important for us to kind of make those decisions, and we have that kind of worked out.
How much money do you think you need?
How much do you have?
So you're just starting, and you've done maybe some scattered site or housing, and you now have an opportunity to do a joint venture with a developer. How much money as the nonprofit do you think that you really need to fully engage?
So I think that's an important conversation to have with your CFO when you get started in this, and determine like what the budgets or what the ceiling is for projects, and where, how far are you willing to go risking the agency's money to get projects, because you're most likely will not be successful with your first project, or maybe your second project, or maybe your third project. You know, there is substantial output that is generated to get projects going, and sometimes they don't work out, and that money obviously you're not going to be able to get refunded, so you have to move on to the next project. So everybody has to kind of really be comfortable with losing some money initially to kind of work to get to the place where you get some money.
200,000. She won't give me a number. Are there other people in your organization that you call on in the course of the day-to-day interaction? Like, who else on your team has to be involved and looped in on a regular basis?
For me, I work directly with the CFO on things, so that works or the director of finance. So
Martha, how about you?
So your project will absolutely not succeed unless you have a CSH pre-development loan. That's just rule number one.
Thank you.
No, it's true. Pre-development is really expensive. These projects take forever. We're definitely closing in June. It's June. We're not. No, I'm kidding. But, they take a long time. And so pre-development costs to me are the same as guarantees. They're risk. More risk, more reward. Like, that's the basic line of negotiation, and just because we're mission-driven doesn't mean we play by any different rules. If we're going to put up more risk, whether it's guarantees, whether it's pre-development loan, then we should get a bigger slice of the pie. Mm-hmm. And so it's really a negotiation, and, we should be smart about it. We need to be fiscally responsible. We should not take on more than we can chew. But we also need to get something in return, and we can't grow without putting up some risk. And I'm sure my CFO would not be happy about that. But no, you have to put something out to get something back. That's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Mike, will you give me a number? How much money do you think an organization needs if they really want to do this to start with pre-development costs?
Probably $250,000. But I'm going to put one big caveat on that, is that we'll always try to negotiate a due diligence time period, and sort of evaluating what really is necessary due diligence to make the threshold decision about whether you're going to put money up. You should be able to do it for $30,000 or $40,000. You should be able to get a survey. You should be able to get a phase one. You should be able to talk to your funders in your O agency, and you should have some sense of whether it's a viable project. And if you're finding yourself in for $200,000 only to learn that there's a big glowing tank under an existing slab, then you or your joint venture partner made a big mistake along the way. It shouldn't be like just blind roulette. But I think once you clear those due diligence tasks, sort of the basic ABCs of selecting a site, I think you have to plan on a couple $100,000. There are pre-development loans. There's lots of other details we could talk about, but I think that's in the ballpark. And I'd also say this, and I'll pick on another upstate client that's here. We have a great client, a great builder upstate, CDS Monarch, who does seniors and veterans. And they have a staff. They invested, I don't know exactly what I see Mark looking at me, let's say they invested $500,000 a year in payroll. They had a very specific thing they wanted done. They had, X number of projects they had met, and they decided they needed a little help with something specific, 4% tax credit application. So when they first came to us, they already had a list. It's like, Mike, we want you to do this and not that. And this is what we think it's worth, and this is what we're willing to pay, but we really hope that you'll join the team. So right out of the gate, we had a very clear understanding of who was paying for pre-development costs. We knew exactly where our roles and responsibilities started and finished. They knew exactly what it was going to cost if it was unsuccessful, exactly what it was going to cost if it was successful. And sometimes I think people look at it like they're on their own, like I'm negotiating a joint venture agreement. We've got so many resources. I mean, they knew before they came to me what a fair price was. Shinny has a handbook. CSH has a handbook. Every one of you has peers that have already done housing and partnered with somebody. There's really no reason not to have a good sense of what the partner should do and a good sense of what money you're going to be spending just by talking to the resources that are free and available.
No, that's good. Can all of you maybe say a little bit about, the day-to-day, like who's taking, like you talked about the pre-development expenses and working with environmental consultants and, just that early stage working maybe with a realtor, negotiating with the property owner, like who's taking the lead and what can nonprofits bring to that part of the deal?
So I'm going to say that varies wildly, but there's some really good takeaways on that. And that is, there's nothing wrong with having a relationship with an architect that supports all of your joint ventures. Last night, Tony and I sat at a table at the Well-Life Gala, and we do a lot of work together. We do a lot of work with Well-Life, and Well-Life wants UAI to be available for their projects. That's a very reasonable approach to it, and there's nothing wrong with telling your joint venture partner, this is a contractor we know and trust and have worked with for a long time, and that's the way it's going to be. And in those instances, the initial lead might come from the not-for-profit, like this is who we're using, here's a kickoff meeting. But in Karen's case, she's probably not that interested in sitting down going through the geotechnical report other than to know what happened and whether it was good or bad. So it varies in that way. And I don't know, DePaul has a relationship with Krista. Krista's doing all that for them. They don't need their joint venture partners if they have one to do it because it's already available. And you can give a very client-specific examples up and down the road, but it varies wildly.
Okay. How about Martha? How does SUS handle that when they have a joint venture partner? Because you're a very established organization, so you might actually take part more in the early negotiations around the architect contract, the geotechnical expert. Like, what role are you playing from your vantage point now as being a little bit more senior?
So I think we all keep saying it depends. I don't know why you guys came to a panel to hear us say it depends, but it depends. It depends on the partner. It depends on how many times we've done deals with that partner. So, we have partners that we do repeat deals with, and so we know what their pipeline looks like, and they know what ours looks like. And again, I keep bringing it down to the staff level, but any project manager knows that you could have a really slow week and then at 4:30 on a Friday, all your projects blow up, right? And so being able to manage workflow, both internally and externally with all your various partners, is hard. And it involves, again, a constant feedback loop of checking in and figuring out, okay, what do you guys have closing in June? What do we have closing in June? Because really, for me, the 6 months before closing is when you really need a lead person, right? It's in the time beforehand, things move pretty slowly, so everyone can go to the architect meeting, everyone can participate in everything to various extents. The 6 months before closing, especially if your organization is closing more than one deal in one season, you need a dedicated person for the project.
Right.
And so having a frank conversation with your partner of, I have someone who can do this in the next 6 months, you don't, or vice versa, I think is a good way. And if you have partners you do things over and over with, we all have the same deals closing at the same times. So it's helpful, you take the lead on this one, I'll take the lead on the next one, and we'll make sure we have real staff coverage on everything.
When should organizations walk away from a partnership? Or have any of you walked away from a partnership?
So as I was thinking to this panel, I'm not married, but I feel like JVs are like marriage, and with 35-year regulatory agreement, that sounds like a really long, successful marriage to me. And now throw in MIH, I mean, that's after till death do us part, whatever. So before you bake it in and you sign on the dotted line, you have to have really thought things through and had all these conversations, because it is time, it is money, it's reputational risk with outside and with your board. So ideally, you never have to step away from a deal. Does that mean it doesn't happen? Of course not. But it's really, if you find the right partner, and again, we're dealing with people, right? We talk about partners as these like abstract entities. People move jobs, for-profits and nonprofits, right? It's not just nonprofits who have retention problems. And but you gotta like the people you're working with. And if you trust and like the people you're working with and you do this over and over again, maybe one won't work, that happens. But having a partner that's flexible and you trust, who will work things out and not just say, oh, this is a deal breaker for me. Like, banks do that all the time. We don't need our partners to do that, right? Like, I'm gonna blow up the deal. What does that mean, right? Like, there's always a compromise if you're talking to the right partner.
I think that's a perspective. Mike, I know you've walked away from deals, so
Yeah.
tell us when to walk away from a deal. Be
I'm
honest.
not getting mocked anymore about this equivocation stuff, so it's time to walk away from the deal when you've run out of money and the chances of success are de minimis. We have walked away from a bunch, and I told a story about having trust and relationships. The truth of the matter is Karen and Barbara and I have been working together since the very first day of CSD, and we've never built a project together. So we have 6 or 7 years together. And the challenges were wild. I mean, we have a great site in Freeport. We went and met with the mayor. He's like, oh, I love it. I totally support this. We go to planning board, and I was like ducking rotten tomatoes and open hostility and nonstop criticism that lasted forever. I mean, years. We did a project in Hudson, New York, where we went to 48 planning board meetings, 4 years of planning board meetings. And candidly, I'll call out our friends from OMH, we could only do it because OMH said, yeah, that's discrimination and we're going to back you. And so we did. We slugged it out, and then we slogged out 2 years of a town that hated us and made everything miserable, from fire trucks just miraculously parking in front of our construction gate to any other dirty trick you can think of. So it's a sliding scale. I really think that good developers are not way into the pond at the time they know whether the project can work or not. Like, you really shouldn't be allowing deposits to go hard and big commitments to architects if you're not pretty darn sure that the project can work. You should certainly know if there's an absolute, deal killer embedded in the process. And I will also say one other thing that's changed a little bit is that we're not always perfectly in alignment with our funders, and it's not always the case that the funders are perfectly in alignment with one another. And something I'm doing more of now is trying to make sure that the capital funders and the O agencies sort of view the project the same way. I don't want to give a lot of specifics because I have to live and work in this field for a while, but there are instances where, for example, a not-for-profit might believe that a suburban site is better because that's where their clients are and that the services the client need are there. And perhaps a capital funder might be thinking, well, if we can invest our money in a way that does some urban renewal, maybe we can pull the city sort of out of the doldrums. And it can be in conflict because the service provider and the O agency are really just about the clients. And, it'd be nice if you can also do some, community development, but as a practical matter, clients come first. And there's a good reason, perhaps, why a capital funder might want to tie their housing money with some other state or federal money or something that's going into a city. So I think that those conversations have to happen. You have to do basic due diligence. And if you do those two things and you still get clobbered, then chances are you needed more of a partner than you had. Because if nothing else, your partner should help you, notwithstanding my stint in Freeport, should help you avoid the rotten tomatoes and abuse.
Great. So thank you, panelists. I'm going to open to questions from the audience. We have 3 awesome perspectives and levels of expertise here, so I hope that you all take advantage and ask some questions of our panelists. Anybody? If you could come up to the mic, that would be great so everybody could hear you. Okay.
You mentioned earlier a $1 million liquidity
Mike, you want to start?
I don't
can
think-
fill in the gaps.
I don't think the higher liquidity affects the raise much. I think the raise is driven by geography and sort of the strength of the deal. We have seen instances, well, Megan and I have an instance right now where we provided a limited guarantee to sort of buttress that $1 million liquidity requirement. So you can do it together. I would just say if you're going to invite your for-profit to provide 30-year guarantees, right, and 15-year tax credit lookbacks, then you have to be prepared to hear them say that they want a voice in what the building looks like. Is the construction cost reasonable? They're going to be a more active partner. And for the for-profit side, if you're not, like in my case, most of the time we're not coming up with the bulk of the capital, I have to have a reasonable expectation that it's a not-for-profit driven and dominated relationship, and that's sort of the trade-off.
Yeah, I think guarantees are one of the trickiest parts of JV negotiations for exactly the reason you raise, is that a lot of nonprofits don't have or don't want to put up that amount of liquidity. But as the original slide show, we bring a lot of other things. So saying we don't want to put up the liquidity is not crazy at all, I think. But to Mike's point, it's a give and take. If you don't want to put up any risk, your reward's going to be lower. That's just reality.
Right. And I do think that, we have syndicators in the room, so maybe they can elaborate. But what we've generally seen is that once you have the tax credit deal, in order for a syndicator to shop your deal and get investors, they are going to be looking at the financial health of the nonprofit organization, even with partners. Partners definitely bolster, and they definitely will, pull a deal across the finish line. But I do think that, having that benchmark of $1 million liquidity is a good place. Do deals get done when organizations don't have that liquidity? Yes, they do, but then we go into the conversation that our panelists are having. Then, there's probably just the partners taking on more risk, investing more into the deal, so then, the negotiation around the developer fees and other financial aspects of the deal come into play.
Oh, can I add one thing? Just when we think about guarantees in general, there's a big difference between construction and operating guarantees. Mm-hmm. And so in my experience, for-profit partners may be more willing to take on some of the construction risk, especially if they're self-performing GCs. And equally, nonprofits may be more comfortable with longer-term operating guarantees, which are lower on the dollar, like the sticker shock. We're mission-driven. The whole point of being a nonprofit is you hold the asset forever. So we're going to care about the condition of our buildings. We're going to be the ones operating them. Our people are living in them. We care that the building operates well. And so betting our money on that is just betting on ourselves.
Yep, great. Great question. Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Mark Hurwitz from Urban Pathways. We're a nonprofit that runs our own supportive housing, but we're recently moving into joint ventures because it allows us to expand the work we do to achieve our mission.
Mm-hmm.
In our own housing, we have very specific ways and ideas about once the housing is built, how security, for instance, interacts with social services, or how social services reacts with the property management on rent collection issues. And so my question for anyone on the panel is, in setting up joint ventures where very early on you're thinking about what's going to happen when the building gets built, is it going to be a turnkey that gets handed over to the nonprofit? Is it going to continue to be a relationship? Are third-party property managers or security firms going to be brought in? Have any of you identified ways to effectively identify and solve those pitfalls early in the dance, so to speak, so that they don't become a problem several years later once the building opens?
I think that's a conversation that we have quite frequently. Mike and CSD Housing generally defer program-related questions to me or to Federation in terms of projects that we're looking at, either in the, in our Vital Brooklyn proposal, we talked a lot about how we were going to work with frail and elderly in that project. And we did a lot of the program piece, and they did a lot of the financial piece and kind of wrangled all of the other folks that are involved with that RFP. But I think you have to have a joint venture partner that really takes into consideration your experience and how you run your programs and what you want to accomplish with your program, and start having those conversations right away. Like, that is not, determining how your offices are set up, or your security, where your security, your front desk is going to be, or your closed captioned TV, all that stuff is conversations to have early on, and expectations that the nonprofit has for safety and security, and a building that's going to be well built is something that we constantly talk about throughout the development of projects.
So I'll just add that basically we expect our team to be able to tell our clients, like, this is or isn't something that's within sort of the HCR guidelines, or this is or isn't an affordable way to do it. But all the decisions reside with them. And somebody, I know who Urban Pathways is, and for somebody like you, there should be no joint venture partner that's dictating the flow and operation of the building. That should be all yours. You should get real advice, though. If you're picking something that's prohibitively expensive that's never going to get financed, or that the capital funders are going to take back out of the project, then you should be told that, right? So it's an informed decision. But we never make decisions about the programming of the building.
SUS has an interesting, on some deals we do a front of house and back of house split. So because our service staff is in the building, we think it's important for supers and porters to be SUS employees as well. So the way but we don't necessarily, on some deals we do, but we don't necessarily always want to take on compliance, rent collection, et cetera. And so we've had partners where we split it. So the back office, which is rent collection, compliance, et cetera, stays with the partner. And front of house, AKA everything that has to do with the building and bricks and mortar, stays with SUS.
Does that answer your question? Okay, great. And CSH has a great training center that will elaborate lovely on all of the property management models available. So I direct you there. Yes?
Hi, I'm Carolina Cordero-Dyer from Center for Community Alternatives. And let's say we want to do a new project. If we don't have a lot of experience, we definitely think we need a joint venture partner. How do you, so the process for selecting that, I think on the one hand you could jump to, I met this guy at the conference and they're great, right? And jump into something.
Don't do that.
You spend 2 years doing due diligence and interviewing everybody you can think of who does this. So where do you find that balance in the selection? You have a lot of experience and you want to select the right partner.
Great question.
This is the closest knit industry in the world. So the the shortest answer is everybody in this room probably knows some, and there's great ones. There's just great consultants, and there's great JV partners, and there's really no reason that any not-for-profit would go in blind. And if you didn't know another not-for-profit that had one, Shinny or CSH would be able to give you a list. And I personally think it comes down with work with people you like and trust. Sometimes it takes a long time to get to know people, but fundamentally, if you like and trust people, then problems get solved in a reasonable manner. And if it's a shotgun marriage and you met some guy that seemed great and turned out to be less than great, my guess is it'll be hard to solve the first big problem. Even if that guy's me, and this yelling at me thing is not as bad as it sounds, but she does yell at me.
I would recommend also being as structured with your partner selection as you would be for a new hire. So typically as an organization, you have an interview period, you're collecting, or a resume collection period, and then you select, the top ones out of the people who submitted resumes, and then you have an interview process. Put together a committee, right?
So do organizations do RFPs for builders?
Yeah.
Yes, they do. Organizations absolutely do RFPs. You can get that formal with it. That is not in the guidebook, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that. That is definitely a way. You can do it, formalize it in an RFP, and you can do a more casual interview process, but that has structure as well.
And I would suggest if you were to try to find a JV partner, you would want to find, as a new person, as a new group going into development, is finding someone that doesn't have a whole lot of developments happening right now. Because you'd want someone who's available to spend some time with you and to, really teach and partner and not just kind of run with the project, in other words. So someone that may have not the busiest, I would say.
And you can partner with nonprofits too. That's a thing.
Any other questions? Anybody? All right, you have a few more minutes to think about it. Any final words from our panelists? Joint venture advice? What to do first when they leave this room and they're like, they've been convinced by your amazing panel, and then they're going to get back to their desk and say, what do I do now? What do they do? Call me.
Another unscripted question.
Talk to your staff. Your staff have ideas of what, as an organization, you should be doing, and they might have interest in one type of partner, one type of project more than the other. I get that people leave and no one is telling people they should stay at jobs forever, but our staff need to be happy, and projects need to be things they're interested in working in for them to stick around.
I think thinking about what types of project you want to develop and how that fits into the mission of your organization, how it fits into your communities that your organizations are in, and making sure that there is a subsidy or a funding source associated with what you want to do. So in other words, funding, developing a building for a certain population that doesn't have a subsidy attached to it probably isn't going to be very successful. So really looking at who you want to serve and what you want to do and what the outcomes would be will help you kind of determine if a project is feasible, number one, and then also what type of joint venture or partnership you want to get involved with.
And my only good advice is these conferences are great. One nice thing about supportive housing as compared to when I was like a contractor or a lawyer, there are many conferences where you get to know your peers. I literally know at least 50 people sitting in the audience, and I know them strictly through coming to all of these events and getting them over time. And there's no better way to sort of, over a period of time, figure out who you want to work with and how to do it and what experiences not-for-profits are having that are good, what ones are Freeport, and figuring out somewhere in the middle. So I really would be active and be involved and meet people.
I think my final words would be to go back to the point of why all of you decided to come to this panel today. Like, how is joint venturing and developing supportive housing really going to further the goals and the mission of your organization? And if you can clearly identify that and have some just agreement among your organization's leaders, then everything else will fall into place. You have great resources in Shinny, you have great resources in CSH, and we do matchmaking all the time, and we are, in close coordination with all of the funding sources, state and city side. So all of the actual nuts and bolts of getting the deal together you have at your fingertips. You just need to make sure that this is the right next step for your organization and that leadership is on the right page. So thank you all for joining us today.